Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohigian. Other Minds, founded in 1992 in San Francisco by Charles Amerkanian and Jim Newman, is devoted to championing the most original voices in new and experimental music. On Season 5 of the podcast, we're talking with a range of composers, performers, and authors across the field of new music, including the featured composers from the 30th Other Minds Festival, which will take place October 8th to 11th, 2026, at the Brava Theater in San Francisco. Today, I'm joined by musicologist and musician Theodore Gordon. Gordon's work connects experimental music, critical organology, and science and technology studies. He has performed with viola and Buchla instruments at venues including Elastic Arts, Experimental Sound Studio, and Roulette. Gordon is assistant professor of music at Baruch College and serves on the Doctoral Faculty at the CUNY Graduate Center. His first book, The Composer's Black Box: Making Music in Cybernetic America, published in December 2025 by University of California Press, shows how scientific concepts and technologies borrowed from cybernetics, information theory, and systems thinking became catalysts for new musical organizations in the 1960s. Welcome to the podcast, Ted.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off with this idea of the black box. What is it, and how did it open up new modes of electronic music making?
The black box is a really common engineering concept and figure and metaphor. It emerged in electrical engineering in the 1940s, and people like Norbert Wiener and other early cyberneticians use it in various ways. So the origin of the term is there's two origins. One is during World War II, these magnetrons used for radar were kind of passed back and forth between Allied countries, and they were encased in these black metal boxes. And the idea was that it was a secret, so you couldn't know what was inside the box, right? But then those devices actually themselves had this massive ingot in the middle that was impenetrable. So it didn't really matter that you couldn't understand what was inside of it. As long as it worked and as long as you could observe what it did, that's kind of what mattered, right? So in engineering, the black box comes to be used to describe any kind of system, whether that's like an electrical system or a biological system or a physical system, where you can observe what it does, its behavior, you can observe its inputs and its outputs, but you can't know what is inside of it. It's a very basic idea, and it's kind of deceptively simple, because the consequence of that metaphor is that you focus on the behavior of a system, and you really start to think about, well, okay, I don't really care how it works, but I just want to know what it does, and what happens when I behave in certain ways with it. And it encourages a certain kind of experimentation. Now, for some scientists, like for some cyberneticians, and cybernetics is a new discipline that emerges in the 40s, and the person who coins it, the term cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, comes up with that term to describe a self-governing system. For cyberneticians, the black box is a key concept because it's all about enclosing something that's really complex, saving that for later, and focusing on the behavior of a system. And once you know the behavior of a system, you can start to, let's say, feed back the output of a system into its input, right? And in that way, you create this sense of self-governance. For Wiener, there's an amazing asterisk in his 1948 book, Cybernetics, where he uses the term black box, and then the asterisk takes you to the bottom of the page. And he says, a black box is any as yet unanalyzed nonlinear system. Let's break that down a little bit. So a nonlinear system is a system where the input does not relate in a one-to-one or linear way to the output. So if you put in a certain number like 2 and the output is 4, and you put in a number like 4 and the output is 8, you might think, oh, this is a multiplied by 2 system. But then you put in a number like 8 and then the output is something that's not 16, and you're like, okay, that's a nonlinear system, right? So for Wiener, his thinking was that basically any phenomenon in the world could be conceptualized as a black box. And the more you experiment with it and the more you study it, the more you can kind of turn that black box into what he actually calls a white box. So kind of a transparent, knowable system where you could control it and gain a sense of mastery over it. And for most, users of these kinds of systems, that opacity is never transformed into a transparency. So there's always that sense of opacity of the unknown inside the system where you don't really know what's going to happen when you use it. This is a long-winded way of saying that many musicians in the 1960s are encountering this concept through just the fact that there is so much surplus electronic technology, material, components, instruments left over from the previous 40 years of telecommunications, railroad, infrastructure building, the telephone system, radio, World War II. They're encountering these objects and they have no idea what they do, how to use them, and like what could be possible with them, right? The argument here is that many of these instruments and instrumental systems that musicians developed in this moment in the 60s, musicians who were not trained in electrical engineering or cybernetics, they functioned as this kind of black box for a musician. That presented certain challenges, right? Because if you're a musician who is kind of inclined to want to have mastery, control, precision over, their music, the fact that the instrument behaves like a black box and that it's in some way self-regulating, it challenges those desires for control, right? Control is kind of taken away from the human and is distributed in this kind of system, right? For other composers and musicians, that sense of opacity is actually something they totally embraced. And that's why I tried to kind of, with the book, bring different perspectives to musicians who encounter these black boxes or had what I'm calling in the book black box encounters with electronics technology. So it didn't produce just one way of doing music, but a real, spectrum of approaches.
You write in the book about an element of unpredictability that gets built into these systems. So let's start with maybe Morton Subotnick, someone who you write a lot about in the book, who was working closely with Donald Buchla, who was building instruments for him that Subotnick didn't necessarily know all the engineering of it. So how did he build that sense of unpredictability into the music he was making?
It's not exactly unpredictability. So it's less of a kind of a Cagean model of, unforeseen sound coming from an action and less a sense of complexity of control. So for Subotnick, he came up with that term that I used in the title, the composer's black box. And he remembers in many interviews, he kind of tells a similar story where he was thinking about I know that we're in the information age. We have the transistor. Things are going to be small and cheap. I want to make an instrument, an electronic music instrument for the information age that is intentional and could fully exploit or harness the potentials of this technology. And that means complexity. That means more than just, using sine wave oscillators and filters and this kind of like monodimensional way of making electronic music. He imagined a kind of a system. He imagined a kind of an analog electronic music computer. In an interview that he did in the mid-2000s with Maggie Bain and David Bernstein for the San Francisco Tape Music Center book, also published by University of California Press, he recalls that he would kind of take a page of the score of, oh my God, my French pronunciation is terrible, Le Marteau Sans Maître, The Hammer Without a Master, by Pierre Boulez, and he would kind of look at the score and imagine a kind of a system that would allow him to account for every parameterized dimension in that score. And there are a lot of parameterized dimensions in that score, right? Because it's a work of integral serialism with a very opaque way that it was composed. And then kind of imagine like a discrete module or part of an electronic music making system that could control those parameters in that dimension, right? So once you get a bunch of those modules together and systematize them, it's not so much unpredictability as much as it is complexity and nonlinearity that results from that, right? So once Buchla made his modular electronic music system, and once Subotnick started experimenting with it in his studio on Bleecker Street, this was not the first system that Don Buchla made that was housed in Mills College, but Subotnick gets a later system, and it's installed in New York. It takes him 13 months of negotiation with the system to figure out how he wants to use it. And that resulted in, this very masterful album, Silver Apples of the Moon, which comes out in 67. So for Subotnick, it's an interesting case because, what he really wants is actually control. Like, he wants control over more discrete parameters in more dimensions than anybody had possibly had control over sound, previously. But that is difficult to achieve, and it's difficult to plan for. And I think there's a reason it took him, over a year to kind of figure out how to do it,
Let's listen to an excerpt of Morton Subotnick's Silver Apples of the Moon, released by Nonesuch. What was the role of instrument designers like Don Buchla and Robert Moog on the development of this kind of music? Was there a lot of back and forth between them and composers or electronic music performers and how these things were getting built?
Well, I think basically everybody is kind of a systems designer in this era, right? I mean, even musicians like Alvin Lucier or Pauline Oliveros, who are not working directly with instrument designers, or even someone like Sun Ra, who's not working directly with Moog to design his instrument that he got from Moog, the Mini Moog. They're conceptualizing what they do using these concepts and metaphors of the information age, right? Cybernetics, feedback, black box systems, information. They're imagining that what they're doing is an informational, pursuit. They have information in their brains, or maybe sound is information, and information also behaves like a signal. It can be carried on a carrier wave or in a channel. It's kind of fungible between themselves and their instruments. So in many ways, the kinds of instrumental systems that musicians started to use are a result of this, pretty consistent negotiation back and forth between kind of like creative intentions or fantasies and what the technology can actually achieve or do, In the case of Don Buchla, both Mort and Don recall that many of the modules were kind of designed in collaboration. Some very explicitly, like Mort Subotnick wanted an envelope follower that would allow him to use a microphone in a gestural way. So he would have a microphone, hook it up to the envelope follower, and it would create a control voltage envelope based on the amplitude or the loudness of his voice. So he could do these kind of gestural, have this kind of gestural control with his instrument. Other people like Sun Ra, he kind of received this, kind of broken prototype of the Mini Moog. And when he played it, it produced this amazing sound that really nobody knew how he was doing it. I mean, there's these interviews with people who worked in the Moog factory who would go to see him in this relatively short period when he was playing the Mini Moog. And they would report like, I have no idea how, Ra got to get the Mini Moog to make that sound. And so in a way, like it was his instrument. It was not necessarily an extension of himself, right? And I go into that in detail in the chapter of about his use of the Mini Moog. But it was kind of like his own personal instrument. I mean, no one else could use it in the way that he did. And he really kind of like negotiated a way to use it that achieved, his philosophical and ideological goals in that period in 1970 and 71.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Nuit de la Fondation Macht by Sun Ra, released on Shandar. Much of the history in this book is taking place in the San Francisco Bay Area with people like Subotnick, Buchla, Oliveros. Why did the Bay Area become such an important center for this kind of music in the 60s?
Well, I should be clear that, the title of the book is The Composer's Black Box, Making Music in Cybernetic America. And cybernetics was a nearly ubiquitous discipline, field, idea across the United States of America, Canada, North America, Central America, South America, East Asia. I mean, really across the world, and Europe, of course. And people were experimenting with these ideas and technologies all over the country, most often in places with lots of institutional funding, such as the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center, such as the University of Illinois Electronic Music Studio, such as the University of Toronto Electronic Music Studio, the CLIAM studio in Buenos Aires. There are these really well-funded, kind of state-funded studios across the world that where there are experts doing this kind of work, right? In some cases, experts in linguistics. Jennifer Iverson's book has a fascinating history about all the people at the VDR studio in Köln who kind of come out of World War II era linguistics research, the Studio di Fonologica in Milan. In all those places, there's experts. In the Bay Area, there are no experts. Like the San Francisco Tape Music Center really was founded by Ramon Sender and Subotnick, who had no expertise, but extremely ripe imaginations and kind of creative visions about what this kind of technology could do. Part of the reason I chose to focus so much on non-experts is because they kind of operationalize these concepts in really unusual ways that an expert might not ever think of. The Bay Area plays a big part of it because, basically because the San Francisco Tape Music Center was there and was a major center for this kind of, amateur, I don't know if I call it amateur, let's say just non-expert experimentation with these technologies. And because they had, they did have an expert, or there was one expert who was Don Buchla. And, Buchla brought his electrical engineering expertise to the table. And he also, made it materially possible to build these systems. I mean, he had connections, in Berkeley. He could manufacture things. He had access to cutting edge components like light emitting diodes, which nowadays, are kind of like the cheapest thing you could ever imagine. But in those days, were extremely new and cost tons of money. So yeah, I think that's why this kind of experimentation was so ripe in the Bay. And the other part is that the counterculture, and specifically experimentation with psychedelic drugs, which, I always say this in interviews, they were not illegal, when the people experimenting with them in 63, 4, 5, 6, 7 were experimenting with them, right? Psychedelics played a huge part in Don Buchla's understanding of the possibilities and potentials of the mind as a computational system and what could be done to kind of extend and augment and complexify that system, through technology, whether that's chemical technology or electronics technology.
And how was what Pauline Oliveros was doing at the San Francisco Tape Music Center different from what Subotnick and Buchla were working on?
The Buchla box really was, as I quoted Bill McGinnis, who recently passed in the book, but when I was talking with him about it, in the beginning, he told me, yeah, Ramon and Mort both wanted this thing, but then Ramon kind of dropped out or backed out of that project, and it became what Bill remembers as Mort's project. It was really Mort's thing. And Pauline had been less interested in this kind of more complete control or more complex control over more, parameters, and more interested in the kind of intuitive music making that she could achieve by attending to her body and her attention and her consciousness itself as a computational system, right? She told this anecdote over and over again of this kind of foundational moment where she got this cheap tape recorder as a gift. She put the microphone out of her window and hit record and then listened back to the feedback from that recording device and realized there were all these sounds that existed that she hadn't been attending to. And then she took from that a kind of a lesson, which was, if I treat my attention and the kind of sensory apparatuses of my body as a system, as an informational system, I can do more with it. I can attend to more things with it, and I can change my consciousness very radically. And because of that, she was really interested in improvisation and really interested in kind of these intuitive or automatic processes in improvisation. So it was less about more complete control and more about a kind of a sense of self-exploration. Very concretely, how that played out at the Tape Center was that, one of the kind of more pleasurable experiences she had explored since, she began to play the accordion as a teenager was exploring the physical sensation of beat frequencies that you can make pretty easily with an accordion. If you take, two adjacent notes, like a minor second in the low register, and you pull really hard on the bellows or push, you get this vibration, right? Kind of like she very intuitively thought, okay, well, I know that such a thing as beat frequencies exist. I've also heard them described as combination tones and difference tones. And what if I tried to do that in electronics with oscillators? Now, of course, beat frequencies, which are a physical phenomenon, combination tones and difference tones, which are a psychoacoustic phenomenon, and electrical intermodulation, which is a kind of an electrical signal phenomenon, are all exist in different media, and they all actually behave differently. It's not as simple as this kind of one-to-one connection between all three of those things. But because Oliveros drew those connections, she very kind of, in a very beautifully simple way, just was like, all right, I'll just hook up these oscillators that I have lying around to the speakers and see if I can get them to make combination tones and stuff. And she got way more than she bargained for, because not only, well, first they didn't make any sound because, she just plugged them into speakers. And these are supersonic oscillators, I should mention, right? They produce sine waves like way above the upper limit of human audibility, more than 20,000 hertz. And their dials are logarithmic. So when you're in the upper part of the dial, like every little movement you make of your fingers will change the frequency by 5,000 hertz, 10,000 hertz, right? So because the experiment kind of failed the first time, she plugged each of the oscillators into a line amplifier and then just electrically summed them in this patch bay at the Tape Music Center, which, you're not supposed to do, right? Because it's a passive patch bay. It's not designed to handle amplified signal. And something in the patch bay acted as a kind of a makeshift intermodulator. So not a ring modulator, which would reject the input frequencies and only give you the sum or difference of them, but it produced signals at the sum and difference of the fundamental frequency. And because these were not perfect sine wave oscillators, they also produced harmonics. So they would produce sums and differences at the second and third harmonic of the fundamental frequency. So second order modulation products and third order modulation products, and so on and so forth. And then, on quarter-inch tape, analog, audio tape, there's a bias frequency around 80,000 hertz, which is printed on the tape to improve low frequency response. And she discovered also very quickly that when you record supersonic signal onto a tape, that also interferes or intermodulates with the bias frequency on the tape. So she produced this really chaotic and super complex performance technique. And she also threw tape delay on it, right? So this was a way where she could have her hands on these two oscillators, and in a way where she really didn't exactly know what would happen. So this is like a black box, right? She could move the dials, imperceptibly small movements of her hands, and it would have these massive, huge reverberant sounds that would come out of the system, right? These are the tapes that are called the mnemonics tapes. I can't say that word. Mnemonics. And she made many of these tapes. They're all in the archive. And she writes a letter to David Tudor about them. And she says, the studio's going good. Moore's working with Don. They're getting the studio set up. Meanwhile, I'm working on a totally new way to make music. Come down again. Come visit David, and we'll make a totally new way of doing a concert. That's how she phrases it. And, these tapes are just they're the length of a reel of tape. There's no composite, and this isn't a critique, but there's no compositional material. There's no plan, right? It's an improvisation that's recorded, like the artifact of the improvisation is recorded on the length of a reel of tape. And there's a lot of these. And, I think they pretty much languished in the archive until there were some public performances of her tape works, but they were all re-released in 2012, I want to say, and that big Oliveros box set by Important Records. So luckily for us, we can listen to all of these now. And Mills College actually has even more in the CCM archive too. Pauline's experiments with these kinds of black box electronics technologies were really different than her colleague Subotnick's, even though they were at the same, in the same building, in the same institution, the Tate Music Center.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Mnemonics by Pauline Oliveros. Two of your other subjects, Alvin Lucier and Sun Ra, were working on the East Coast. Were they also in this sort of non-expert realm of this kind of music making?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, and when I say non-expert, I don't mean non-expert at music. I mean non-expert at electrical engineering, right? So they encountered these novel technologies and took them in really differing ways from each other. I mean, Sun Ra was kind of an expert at electrical and electronic keyboard instruments, right? He, from the earliest days that those instruments were commercially available in the States, he bought them, he acquired them. So even in the 1940s, he's playing like a Hammond solo vox. This kind of early, it is an electronic system. It has, vacuum tube oscillators. He's incorporating electronic instruments into his compositional life and the orchestra, or what became the orchestra, his ensemble. He's mostly a pianist and organist, though. And, his compositions, I mean, even the more kind of, when the compositions got more out, so to speak, let's say beginning in 65, 66, with the move to New York and projects like Atlantis, they still rely on a really complex harmonic language. And, there's scores for all those pieces too. And, there's chords, there's melodies, there's charts. And, he demanded precision and discipline from his ensemble, the orchestra. Now, with the Mini Moog, you can't play a chord on the Mini Moog. And in fact, with the prototype that he acquired, you can't really even play a melody on it, because the oscillators were really difficult to kind of tune together to produce a sound that was a harmonic sound. That is to say, where the overtones related to each other in a rational way so that it would be perceived as having the quality of pitch. It was much easier on that prototype that he had to produce an inharmonic sound that didn't have the quality of pitch. And because the keyboard was monophonic, meaning that only one key could control the oscillators at a time, it's not the same as saying it could only make one pitch at a time, because there were 3 oscillators, right? But only one key would be controlling the frequency of those oscillators at a time. You couldn't play chords, you couldn't really play melodies, and he had to figure out a new way to incorporate that instrument into his ensemble playing, or his performance practice. And in fact, the way that he figured out how to do it was to not incorporate it into his ensemble playing at all, and only play it as a solo instrument, which I think is actually really consequential. And it's unusual. I mean, obviously there are Sun Ra solos, at every concert he takes a solo, but when he's soloing with an organ, like a Farfisa or a Gibson, Kalamazoo organ, there is always, harmonic content, even if the harmony is like a big cluster, like he'll put his arm on the keyboard or something, right? But with the Mini Moog, he had to kind of like adapt and adjust and really think carefully about what it was that he was doing. And in that sense, I think it's really fascinating that the Mini Moog, the period in which he acquires and plays the Mini Moog on tour, which is summer of 1970 into the first years of the 1970s, is the same period where he's really fleshing out his philosophy on discipline and precision. And so he's not able to control the instrument. He's not able to turn the black box into a white box, right? He's not able to analyze the nonlinear behaviors of the instrument because it's so weird and kind of like there's all these engineering errors with it, right? Because it's a prototype. Because of that like non-expert approach to it, I think that's what makes the music from that period so amazing and so fascinating. And for Lucier, I would say he tried to be an expert. I mean, in his archive at the New York Public Library, one of the most amazing things that he saved were all of his notebooks from all the classes that he was auditing at Brandeis as a young faculty member. He had such an amazing thirst for knowledge, scientific knowledge, biological knowledge, physics knowledge. He was taking classes in like code, computer coding, Fortran. He was reading voraciously. All of his notes are there. I think because of that amateur, in the true sense of the word, like doing it for love, because of that approach to novel instruments that he encountered, he never used, the instruments that he encountered the way that their designers intended them to be used, right? He always figured out like really unusual and like very kind of poetic ways to utilize these instruments. Sometimes they're instruments of war, like the Sylvania vocoder.
Can you explain the origin of the vocoder?
Oh, it's a long story. I mean, the vocoder was developed to basically encode human voices for cryptographic communication in World War II. So you take a complex analog sound signal and you break it into 8 or 10 or 12 frequency bands. You digitally encode that onto a disk, and then you can encrypt that. You kind of mask it with a noise source, and then you send the noisy disk over to somewhere else, and they have the secret code disk, and they kind of decode it, right? By the 60s, the Sylvania Electronics Corporation, which was one of the major electronics suppliers to the Department of Defense, Sylvania made a vocoder. They were in the greater Boston area, which is where he lived. They commissioned him to write a piece with the vocoder. That became North American Time Capsule 1967. So in that sense, the Sylvania vocoder is, it's like it comes from this defense contractor. One of the most amazing archival finds I made was in Lucier's archive was the Sylvania like internal magazine. And it's all about like the Korean War and the communists and all these like, crazy papers about like increasing productivity and defense, all this defense stuff. And the middle of the magazine is like this big feature on Alvin Lucier and all these like, like these like photographs of him. The author of the article obviously has no idea what electronic music is or what experimental music is, but he's in this world, like he's in this kind of military industrial academic complex, and he approaches it and again, I don't mean this in a critical way, but he approaches it kind of naively, to say like, well, what do these instruments actually do, and what kind of sounds do they make, and how do they behave, and what can I do with them? And he kind of like makes these explorations, these poetic explorations of the instruments based on that.
Let's listen to an excerpt of Vespers by Alvin Lucier. Would you talk about your own experience, either as a performer or through your research working with these instruments that these composers were using?
Sure. So I started to play with a Buchla system in 2016, I guess, maybe, 10 years ago. I was a grad student. I was doing preliminary research on Buchla for my dissertation, which was about the San Francisco Tape Music Center, kind of like an institutional history of that center. And I had a sense that if I really wanted to understand the instrument, I had to spend time with it and figure out how it behaved and what it did. And in a very financially misguided way, I blew an entire stipend check on, purchasing this instrument. And I got it. And I had been so immersed in reading everything that Morton Subotnick had said about, the original Buchla box. This wasn't obviously the original Buchla 100 series, but it was designed in 72, 73. So I thought it would be pretty comparable. I had read all the stuff he wrote about it, kind of like extending the performer's inner creativity in a kind of a gestural way. I had, of course, read all the marketing copy that had been written by companies like Moog and the company that bought Buchla Electronic Musical Instruments in the 2010s, which was really kind of like in the midst of the analog revival. When I got the instrument, I was like, this is going to be amazing. It's going to unlock all this creativity in me. I'm going to be able to make all these cool sounds I never could make before. But, I opened up the box, I plugged it in, and I couldn't even figure out how to get it to make a sound. Then I realized I have to actually learn all this really complex patching and nomenclature and all these functions and figure out what all these things do. And I had this interesting, frustrating experience where it's actually all these fantasies about the instrument can be totally tailored to the individual musician's desires, and the instrument will unlock all this creativity, and the instrument will be gestural and immediate. All those things were, I was like, that didn't happen, and it took so much time to kind of get to that point. And I think that really sparked the concept of the book coming out of the dissertation project, which was really just like an institutional history of the Tape Music Center. I started to think, well, actually, many musicians who are trained as musicians, when they encounter these electronic musical instruments that are pretty rudimentary, some of which don't have, interfaces that are familiar, like a black and white musical keyboard, they must have had similar experiences. And I was so curious about the kind of negotiations that musicians had to make with technologies before they got to a point in their careers where they could maybe rightfully claim that the instruments were, expressive or personal, et cetera. And I, through doing this research, I realized there is this moment in the mid to late 60s when many of these instruments are newly available, when people are making all kinds of confusing, sometimes failed, sometimes just kind of sketchy performances, compositional ideas, improvisational practices with these instruments. And all that gets kind of shored up in the 70s, people's compositional practices or musical practices with these instruments become more normalized and regulated in the 70s. For example, Alvin Lucier in the 60s, and I write about this in the chapter, he had an amazingly prolific amount of sketches and ideas of things to do with new technologies, only a few of which kind of survived that decade. And by the 70s, he really cleans up his work list, and he saved all this stuff. So it's in the archive, and I like to think that he wanted people to revisit these earlier sketches, right? But, his work kind of takes on a certain philosophy and ethics by the 70s. But if you look at the stuff from the 60s, it really complicates that reading. Same thing with Sun Ra. By the mid 70s, he's abandoned the prototype Mini Moog because he can't play it with the orchestra. He can't play tunes on it. He gets two Model D Mini Moogs, which are the commercially available models. You see those in Spaces the Place, the 1974 film. And then eventually he gets a polyphonic synthesizer, Krumar. I think it's a 6-voice. It can do 6-voice polyphony. So you can play chords on it. It's just, it's basically a fancier electric organ or keyboard instrument. And so that initial kind of like frustrated experience I had with this kind of black box, that really led me to think about conceptualizing a book project around musicians' early encounters with black box technologies, and really digging into those moments of apparent failure or tension or friction between creative and philosophical desires and technical performance and behavior and possibility.
I'm not sure if you'd still consider us to be in Cybernetic America, but...
Oh, absolutely. I do.
So how is this kind of music making working today when, everything's in the computer and you don't necessarily have to know how any of it works to make music with it?
Interestingly, one of the kind of fantasies that Morton Subotnick had about the Buchla box, or about the composer's black box, was that it would allow for a personalized, immediate music that was de-skilled. It wouldn't take 10 years of conservatory training to be able to do it. And it would allow each individual person to kind of make their own personalized music immediately, right? You just have creative gesture as the input, and you would get the output as the kind of the sound piece, like the audio, right? We saw similar promises not only with like GarageBand and like the era of like the personalized DAW in the bedroom studio, but the same promises are made by, AI, generative AI audio platforms, right? Where all the user has to do is input something simple and they'll get this amazing, individualized, personalized product as an output, right? So in a way, like the fundamental concepts of the information age are still the concepts that govern most of our society. Computational metaphors for mind are the basis for all of cognitive science and neuroscience, right? Many tech moguls envision human consciousness as a kind of a complex computational phenomenon. This is how we get agentic AI, right? And AI agents. And, it goes without saying that the fundamental concepts behind current AI all emerged out of the cybernetics moment in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They just didn't have the computational power back then, right, to do it. So we still see the kind of a shared sense of fantasy that gets normalized and scales really quickly, right? It's a very basic fantasy. Every individual person can do something that's de-skilled and fun and beautiful, right? But we also, I think, with that, there's two things that come out of that. One is that in the analog revival world of Eurorack and modular synthesizers, there's also a kind of a pervasive fantasy that you can build your own personalized instrument by buying and selling and trading enough Eurorack modules to assemble this perfect, case that will kind of like do this amazing thing that only you could do, right? There's an interesting friction there because the most common critique of that is like, well, all these hobbyists will buy these incredibly expensive Eurorack systems, but none of them are actually making music on them. They're just kind of playing with them as toys, right? I think it's a valid critique, but also at the same time, it begs the question of like what the social purpose of these instruments is and what kind of sociality these instruments make possible, right? So for someone like Morton Subotnick, he wanted these instruments to enable the social pursuit of being a composer and being a composer in a more precise way, right? A way that could more precisely control multiple dimensions at once, right? And he did that, which is amazing. For other people who are using the same system, the second or third Buchla box that was ever built was commissioned by Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass, for this fledgling commune rock band called the Anonymous Artists of America. And they were total amateurs. I mean, they didn't know how to play instruments, but they had a rich or wealthy, kind of charismatic young leader who's the heir to a lumber fortune who bought them all instruments. And of course, they had a wealthy friend, Richard Alpert, who commissioned them a Buchla system and also gave them 100,000 micrograms of LSD as a kind of a gift to get them going, right? The social use that they put the Buchla to, they tried to use it in a rock band, but it failed because it's really hard to get a Buchla, so-called 100 series Buchla box to make any kind of harmonic sound, right? It's hard to get it to do that. It's hard to get it to tune the touch-controlled voltage source to play like in key, right? So they tried to use it as an instrument in a rock band, but that failed. And quickly, it became kind of used as this like psychedelic tool for exploration, right? And for them, that was a valid use of the instrument. That kind of like, like black box, cybernetic encounter where the human user is kind of coupled to this novel technology that totally changes the way that their behavior and perception relate to like sounds in the world. It's a very similar experience to having a psychedelic experience by taking acid, which is what they also did, most of the time, or a lot of the time. So, it's like, do black boxes make music? They make sound. Can they enable more precise control of parameters? Yes, but with that also comes more complexity. What is the consequence of that? Well, you could use them to compose. It's difficult. It's easier to use Max MSP or, any number of computer programs where you can have much more precise control over things. So what are they for? What's their purpose? That's an open question, and that's a social question. And I think that's an interesting one to keep thinking about, basically, because if the goal of all of our science and technology and venture capital money is just to get individual users to like produce kind of AI slop, that's kind of bleak, but maybe there are other purposes, social purposes that the technology could be put to. And I think trying to kind of recover those social purposes by revisiting some of these really obscure moments in the 60s is worth doing.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. So thank you so much, Ted, for talking with me today.
Thanks so much.
Theodore Gordon's book, The Composer's Black Box, is available now from University of California Press. We'll be back in a few weeks for interviews with the composers of our upcoming 30th Other Minds Festival. Thank you, Ted, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been an episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 30th festival is October 8th to 11th, 2026 at the Brava Theater in San Francisco.